Okay, so welcome. This is our 8th mathematics research talk, where we are sharing small-scale research projects which we think are of interest to teachers and everybody involved in maths education. And I'm delighted that Andy's going to do the talk for us tonight, looking at teaching for mastery in the voice of the mathematics textbook. I know Andy will explain it, but I know this comes from some research he's involved in that has led to the work that he's doing towards his PhD. But I'm going to hand over to Andy now.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll share my screen and I will, hopefully explain it sufficiently so that it makes sense. So here we go, let's share it. So this works. Just someone give me a thumbs up. Can you see that okay? Yeah, brilliant. So I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I work up in the northwest, sort of on the Wirral. I run Maths Hub, but as Ruth has mentioned, I'm also studying for a PhD at Cumbria University. And I'm here just to talk about not the actual research I'm doing for my PhD, although it is related. And this is some sort of research I started doing before I began my PhD. And you could say this led to me doing my PhD because my colleague, Pete Boyd, who's not with us today, Professor Pete Boyd works at Cumbria. He's the one who encouraged me to start doing the PhD. So it kind of came from some of this work I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk basically about the research we've been doing. I'll structure it and look at sort of it in just realized that's not very good for a maths talk, is it? 1, 2, 4, 5. That's not a trick, that's just a mistake. There we go. I'm going to structure it in 4 parts. So I'll talk a bit about the background and the methods that we've used within the research. And then I'll probably spend longest on the sort of findings and particularly looking at the sort of 2 phases of research we've done. Because the first phase has had a couple of papers published, and the second phase is something we're kind of doing ongoing analysis and looking to publish another paper quite soon. So let's get going. Here we go. So if I rewind back to about 2015, I was at that time running a teaching school alliance, which was called Deep Learning. And as an alliance, we were working with a group of schools to lead a curriculum development project where we were focused on this idea of mastery, teaching for mastery, across a network of schools. And that network of schools grew, I think, at its peak to around 100 schools across the Northwest. It began with about sort of 10 and it gradually grew. So we were working on this curriculum development project and we were using a combination of kind of what I would describe as informal lesson study, not formally structured lesson study, but we were informally going in, studying lessons and discussing practice. We were doing what we were calling classroom coaching, where we were going in and coaching one another in lessons across schools and doing also workshops and training days for everyone in the group of schools. And a major part of this is that all the schools involved were using a textbook. So that was one of the things that kind of connected everyone across this development project. And the textbook we were using is Maths No Problem. I should say I don't work for them. I have no connection for them. It's just that at the time they were the sort of only primary textbook that was around. And I think shortly after another one was published. And then now there are quite a few. But basically we were doing all this and we thought, well, we should probably research it. We want to find out actually a bit more about what's going on rather than just sort of jumping into doing all this stuff. We thought, well, let's do some research about it. Let's find out. So we contacted Pete Boyd at Cumbria University and we met with him and that's sort of where this all came from, really. So in collaboration with him, I set up the research project, which I'm going to talk to you about. So the actual curriculum development project itself, there are just a couple of things. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but I think it's important for people to be aware of that there were some sort of key aspects within it. So the first one is that all the teachers were encouraged to use a lesson structure. This wasn't like a really prescriptive thing where you had a certain amount of time to spend on particular things, but it was a kind of a loose structure which most lessons should follow. And that included what we call an anchor task, which is a problem you would share at the beginning of a lesson that would be used to teach a concept or an idea or a skill in maths. I've already mentioned use of textbooks and workbooks. A strong emphasis on thinking about representations as being concrete, pictorial and abstract. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that now. At the time, to some teachers, that was quite new. There was a real strong emphasis on thinking about teaching for conceptual understanding and also teaching through problems. So these were some of the key sort of themes that were running through that curriculum development project. So when I'm sharing some of the things from the research with you, it's important, I think, to keep that in the back of your mind, that these were the things that we were working on with the teachers at the time. A couple of things I wanted to raise as well about terminology. So the first thing you will see is that in some of our early work, we talk about Singapore maths. And over time, we sort of realized, well, Singapore maths is just maths. Maths isn't different in Singapore. There might be certain things that are common to the way it's taught in Singapore, but we realized that actually that wasn't what we were trying to do in England. We weren't just trying to copy what they do in Singapore. We were trying to learn a little bit from it. And primarily, I think that came from the fact that one of the main authors from the textbook was a sort of key person in the Singaporean education system. And that little picture is from him, Dr. Yap Ban Ha, because he always said, well, in Singapore, we just call it math. and I think that was an important point. So you will see that in some of our early papers, but now we would probably not use that terminology. The second thing I think is important to think about then is the fact that mastery itself is used to refer to many things. And I think it's still probably a multi sort of faceted word, and it's used really commonly at the moment in education, particularly in our education system, isn't it? But it can mean all kinds of things. So I've put a couple of the things in those little clouds there that when you look at the research are talked about in terms of mastery. So in some ways, mastery is about beliefs about all pupils being able to achieve the math. So when you go and look back at some of the early stuff like Bloom's work, it's about trying to teach in a way so that all pupils, or all but a small minority, can achieve the curriculum content. But then we could look at mastery and think about, well, mastery pedagogy, what's that? And certainly a lot of the work through the Maths Hubs is kind of stipulating particular ways of teaching maths that people might call it mastery pedagogy. Then we could have mastery as an outcome, mastery learning. Have you mastered something, and what does it mean to master something? What does it mean to have mastered addition or multiplication or anything like that? And that's another way of thinking about it. And then we could have mastery in relation to mindset, because when you look at the literature around mindset, they talk about mastery orientation, and that means that's referring to your intentions behind your learning, really. So it's a difficult word. It's a very difficult word. And so it's something that we kind of struggled with early on, and we realized that you can't really contain it in one neat sentence that describes it, I think, but we have to acknowledge that it's kind of involving all these different things to some extent. So yeah, I think that's just quite important as well. Our study then, I said I was going to talk about the sort of two phases. The first phase began right at the beginning then, back in 2015, where we were kind of looking at this question, which is, I'll let you read it, I won't read it out. Focusing on the teachers who were involved in this curriculum development project and what was actually going on, what was happening to their practice and their beliefs. So we sort of invited, it was an open invitation to anyone involved from those schools, whether they wanted to get involved. And what we did was we ended up with 7 teacher researchers. So we weren't trying to do research on them. We were trying to get them involved in the research themselves, which is why we refer to them as teacher researchers. It was essentially a multiple case study. So each teacher was a case in their own right. And we worked with each of them, and they each videoed a lesson. So they video recorded themselves. And they also recorded a discussion between them and a couple of pupils from that lesson, just talking about it and asking some prompts that we had given them. We then did an interview, either myself and Pete Boyd. We interviewed the teacher using their videos as prompts to stimulate discussion about their lesson and their teaching more widely. So that's what's called stimulated video recall. And it's kind of a way of interviewing teachers so that you're not just getting what they think they do. You can try and get a bit more information that's closer to reality, because we've got the video there of them doing it, and they can refer to bits of the video, and we can ask them questions about particular bits of it as well. We also did a focus group discussion with all the teachers, and with all that data, as you can imagine, there was a lot of data. We did thematic analysis, so we looked for sort of common themes. So I'm going to tell you about the key themes that we identified. In phase 2, which is sort of ongoing at the moment, I'll explain why we've ended up doing a sort of second phase. We became interested in this question, which is really focused on the textbook. The textbook and classroom dialogue, and I will explain the rationale for that slightly later on. But in this second phase, we looked at one of the teachers because we thought, actually, if you've got 7 teachers and all that data, it's too much data to really go into depth. So we got invited one teacher who was interested in doing a bit more. And we actually did some lesson analysis using a video. And if we've got time, I might show a clip of the video. And then we also used that video to do another stimulated video recall interview, some textbook analysis, to look at the content of the textbook, and a focus group with all teachers about, we looked at fractions within the textbook because we thought that would be an interesting bit of content. And we did what we called hybrid analysis of that, which is we actually used a framework as well as thematic analysis to look for themes, but we were specifically looking for stuff related to dialogue as well. So the key thing here is that the research was not to try and prove that one way of teaching was better than another. So we weren't setting out to sort of say, this is the way you should teach maths. What we were trying to do was find out more about teachers using mastering textbooks, to find out what was going on, and to make some what we call sort of fuzzy generalizations and contribute to thinking. So, you know, we can't say for definite this is certainly the case, but by studying a small number of teachers' practice in depth, we can kind of start to make some generalizations about what we think is going on, and maybe contribute to a bit of theory. So that was the intention. So nothing I say today is a claim to this is the right way of teaching maths, but it is just to understand a bit more about what's going on. Yeah. So let's have a look. Phase 1, I guess. We sort of found a bunch of themes that we kind of put into 2 different camps, if you like. One set of findings was about beliefs, and one was about practices, you know, actual classroom practice. However, and it will become clear as we look at them, there is crossover between them. So where we found sort of a change in what we thought was a change in beliefs, there's definitely a crossover to some of the practices that we found happening. So what I'm going to do is just share with you these themes and talk a bit about them, and show you some kind of quotes from the teachers and to illustrate some of the things that they were saying. So in terms of beliefs, we felt that there were signs of them shifting their beliefs in 3 different areas. The first area is what we call mathematical mindset. We took this terminology from Jo Boaler. I'm sure people may well be familiar with her work. She talks about mathematical mindsets, and her work is kind of building on the work of Carol Dweck on growth mindsets, and she argues that specific to the subject of mathematics are really complex issues around what it means to do maths and be a mathematician, if you like. So we found that this was a theme that came through, particularly that teachers who are involved in this curriculum development project, their sort of approach to doing maths and pupils being mathematicians and themselves in a way being mathematicians seem to be shifting more towards them feeling like that's what they were, rather than mathematics being something for sort of an elite few people. That it seemed to be that their sort of beliefs about that was shifting through engaging in this project. I think that was quite closely related to this one as well. A theme which came through really strongly in all of the data was that teachers talked quite a lot about how they dealt with mistakes and struggle in maths, and the fact that they felt their practice and their thinking had shifted to seeing these things as actually being not things to be afraid of, but things that offered opportunities to learn from. So when they were teaching a lesson and it was difficult and pupils were really struggling, rather than feeling like they were failing, they started to realize that this was an opportunity and something to not worry about as a teacher. So I think quite closely related to their, their mindset. And the third one, we felt there were kind of shifts in their beliefs about ability and grouping, although these were quite complex. And I'll show you a quote shortly to kind of illustrate why I think they're complex. But this was also closely related to a change in practice, because all of the 7 teacher researchers had moved away from ability grouping, whether that was within their class or setting across 2 classes, and they'd moved to what you might call mixed prior attainment grouping. So that had been a direct change in practice as a sort of product of working in this curriculum development project. So let's have a look here. There's a bit of a delay, so it's appeared on my screen, but there we go. I'll give you a little bit of time just to read that. This is a quote from one of the teachers during one of the interviews. Okay, so this was a teacher talking about the lesson that had been video recorded, and then starting to talk more generally about their practice. And I think you can see here, we felt this quote was quite illustrative of all the other interviews we've done and all the other data we had, that they seem to be implicating this idea that they have become much more comfortable with mistakes and even lessons going wrong. And we found that quite interesting, because they seem to be suggesting that, where they said it doesn't worry me now, well, that sort of implies that they used to get a bit worried when things like that happened. So again, I think that just illustrates this sort of belief in struggle and mistakes not being such an issue. And again, if you just notice the last sort of part of that, where she's saying, well, we can just talk about it and we can have a discussion about it. And what you'll probably notice is in almost all the quotes I show you, that idea of talk and dialogue comes up as a sort of recurring theme. And that's partly why we became really interested in dialogue specifically in terms of teachers using the textbook. Here's another one. Have a quick look at a quick read of this one. Okay, I think I picked this quote because I think it's quite illustrative of the complex sort of ways in which they were thinking. So a couple of things to pull out here. The first one is I've added the bold and the underlining there, because the fact that the teachers are using that language, they're now seeing themselves as a mathematician. And I think that speaks to how they were thinking in relation to their mindset about mathematics and pupils doing mathematics. So rather than pupils doing maths in a maths lesson, almost outcome driven, actually they felt that their pupils, and they're particularly talking about pupils here who had a lower prior attainment compared to others, actually were beginning to see themselves as being able to do maths and as mathematicians. However, the other thing I'd point out here is they're still talking about them as lower ability pupils. So you could argue here that, because they're still using that terminology, that there's something in there that maybe they're still thinking of them as having a bit of a fixed ability, it's low ability. And again, that was quite common across all the teachers. So it seems to be complex. And in particular, one of the teachers, who was a year 6 teacher, even was referencing SATs and things like that, and how there was almost a bit of kind of friction going on between what they were doing in this curriculum development project and then what the kind of external pressures were. So I think there was this difficult relationship going on, I guess. So although there were changes in mindset, I think they were coming up against other things that were a part of our school system. And maybe these are things we want to pick up in discussion a bit later on. I've got a third quote just about this idea of them shifting sort of beliefs and the way they're thinking. So again, I'll give you a minute to just have a read of that. Okay. So again, I deliberately picked this one because it's another teacher, different teacher who are part of the group, but still talking about ability as this thing, you know, high ability, middle ability. But the interesting thing here is, I think this quote again illustrates something that all the teachers were talking about, which is, although they're still talking about the pupils as different abilities, they are changing how their belief in how to structure their classroom. So rather than having ability groups, actually pairing the pupils, it seems to be they're starting to pair pupils more based on who they are as individuals and how well they learn and things like that. And again, that was reiterated in quite a lot of the data. They were talking about things like, well, that child is a really good communicator, and I'll put them with that child because that will really help them and support them, and it will help the child who's communicating well practice their skills of communication. So again, there were these shifts in beliefs about grouping pupils, but still perhaps some other things going on about still thinking of them as high or low ability or whatever. But again, the fact that the dialogue and the talk really comes through here, because they were grouping them in things based on how well they might communicate their ideas and share their thinking. So I think that again shows the importance of dialogue within all this. So those kind of just illustrate this first set of findings about beliefs that we felt were going on, and sort of alongside those, we found that teachers were changing their practice, which I guess isn't surprising. They were part of a curriculum development project, so if they weren't changing some actual practice, you would think, well, what's the point of that project? So it's not surprising in a way, but we certainly found some kind of key things that I think are interesting, especially interesting to teachers who are thinking about making some of these changes themselves. And we described what they were doing as framing learning, and I'll explain that and how that kind of relates to theory in a moment. And we particularly found that they were using sort of three key things, in order to, change their teaching and do this idea of framing learning. So dialogue, I've already mentioned. We found that they talked a lot about exploration, and the third one we called concept building, because they talked a lot about having a better understanding of how pupils actually thought about mathematical ideas, and then being able to sort of build on them through the exploration and through the dialogue. So these three really closely linked with one another. And again, I've got a couple of quotes just to share with you that I think illustrate these quite well. So here's the first one. I'll give you a minute to read it. So I think this one kind of highlights a number of those things, but particularly kind of dialogue, that where she's kind of this teacher is referring to how she used to teach, what she calls didactic teaching. The fact she's talking about the pupils gaining ownership of the emerging rules, and that these are coming out through exploration rather than being explicitly taught. So this teacher is really kind of emphasizing the fact that she feels that she's not necessarily directly explicitly teaching the stuff, but she's enabling the pupils to understand this stuff through that exploration and that dialogue and that discussion. Now, what was quite interesting about this, not only does this sort of show all of those themes all in one, dialogue, exploring, and concept building, I think, it actually sort of, in a way, contrasted like slightly with the next quote. So I'll just show you the next quote. Maybe I'll talk about them both in comparison. So here's what one of the other teachers said. So we found it quite interesting that on the one hand, they were talking a lot about this being, you know, the mathematics coming from discussion with the pupils rather than being explicitly taught, and the mathematics being, I guess, learnt through dialogue or dialogic inquiry, might say. But equally, they were saying, yeah, but it is kind of structured by the teacher, and you know, you are making decisions. You know, you do use the textbook to present content to the pupils. You do choose what you're asking questions about. And so this was really interesting for us, because it sort of presented almost like, well, which one is it? Is it this or is it that? And that helped us kind of come up with this idea of framing and relate it to what I'm going to show you in a moment. The third one here, though, I think I'll give you a minute to read it, but I think this one really does emphasize again or illustrate the importance of dialogue, particularly pupil dialogue. Okay, so I think this quote nicely ties the previous two quotes together. And again, this was one of the other teachers. So again, all these quotes I've picked are we felt were illustrative of a lot of the things the teachers were saying. Because she's sort of saying, well, you know, the teacher learns to shut up, and I quite like how blunt they are with that. It's like, yeah, this is not about the teacher; it's about the pupils. And actually, they listen to the pupils and prompt them to talk about their thinking, but then actually, it's the teacher who with that sort of pool of ideas, they're saying, it's the teacher who then decides where to take it and where to ask questions and where to sort of take that learning. So we took these changes in practice, and we actually we called it framing learning. And the word framing actually comes from sociological theory, a theory by a man named Basil Bernstein. I just think that's a great name, Basil Bernstein. He didn't write specifically about maths, but he talked about the fact that subjects in real life were recontextualized into school subjects. So the subject of mathematics, when we teach it in school and we have it in our school curriculum, it becomes recontextualized into school maths. And he said, when that happens, teachers frame school maths. Teachers are the ones in the classroom who are presenting mathematics to pupils, and they're the ones who are kind of framing that. They're making the decision about how it is experienced by pupils, and how close is that to real mathematics, and how close should it be to real life maths, if you like. So this idea of framing came from there, and I've got a little diagram to share with you a bit more about, you know, what we actually mean when we say framing. So when we're talking about it, we would still have learning outcomes, and the teachers in the research were still quite, you know, adamant that although there was all this discussion and a lot of it was coming from pupils, they still had stuff that the pupils needed to learn. We still have our national curriculum, and they were tested in year 6, and you know, this was quite important. And we still had pupils, so you've got to imagine those dots of pupils. But actually, the teacher's role, instead of pushing them through those hoops, those learning outcomes, by telling them what to do, actually they were using dialogue and exploring and concept building to create a frame around that. And so within that frame, pupils could move around. So they can explore and create and have a bit of autonomy over their learning. So the teacher is ensuring they learn the maths, but the pupils have a bit of freedom and space to not only learn the learning outcomes, but learn a whole host of other things as well, like the ability to communicate their thinking, to use metacognitive thinking, and a whole wealth of other things as well. So this is sort of how we've theorized what was going on. That teachers, it was a kind of funny mixture between what you might call child-led learning or something, but also teacher, you know, the teachers are in control, and they were framing what was going on. And just occasionally the teachers would talk about, one of the things they really enjoyed about this is that you might end up with a child outside of that frame, that one I've just drawn there. You know, occasionally they, despite their best efforts at planning and preparing for lessons, pupils would surprise them. And they really actually found that this was an enjoyable part of the teaching, that they didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but that actually gave them a sense of fulfillment and enjoyment in their teaching as well, I think. So the fact that that could happen, I think, seemed to be something they enjoyed. So there you go. This is sort of they're the main findings from the sort of first phase, and they're published. I've put the links to those papers that those findings are published in on this PowerPoint, and I'm sure I can share this with everyone afterwards. So what I thought I'd do is just share a bit with you before we stop for discussion about where we went to in the second phase, and it's still very much in you know, in progress. We're still doing analysis and we're still writing up the findings, but have a little look at this quote. This is one of the things which sort of prompted us to do a bit more. So this was in the first phase, and this is one of the things the teachers had said. And, you know, we knew that the textbooks were a big part of this because all the teachers were using the textbook. So we sort of knew that, but we didn't want to assume that the teachers felt it was a big part. But actually what we found was that they were saying things like this, you know, they were saying this has really changed. And actually the textbook has been a major part of that. Here's another quote just to illustrate that, another teacher. So I like this quote because it shows how the teacher, actually there's something in this textbook they're using that even the teacher doesn't really understand why it's there, right? And again, they're not dismissing it. They're actually willing to open it up to the pupils and tackle it and go, I wonder why it's there. Should we look at it? Should we pay attention to it, or what? So it struck us that the textbook had a real place within this teaching. So whereas in some models, in fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just flick to, oh, what's going on? I'm going to flick to the next slide and come back to this one. Here we go. Yeah, in some models of teaching, we might look at it like this. There's the teacher, there are the pupils, and there's this maths knowledge, and the job of the teacher is to try and do stuff within the classroom to help pupils better understand that math knowledge. So there's this kind of dialogue going on between those three things. So this model comes from Rezat. It's a paper from 2006, but I think it's quite a useful paper. But they actually argue that when teachers use a textbook, it's more complex than this. And actually, the model should look a bit more like this. So actually teaching in maths when a teacher's using the textbook is more like a conversation or a dialogue between the teacher, the pupils, mathematical knowledge, and the textbook. Because the textbook authors and the contents of that textbook are have a voice in the classroom, and they are part of that lesson, and not necessarily a passive one. And I think that quote before sort of illustrates that teachers may well be doing something without quite fully understanding it because it's there in the textbook, and that there is an important part of what's going on here. So we found, I'll just flick back to that one. There we go. We found that these are some of the things that teachers felt about the textbook. Firstly, it helped their planning focus more on how they were going to teach something rather than what they were going to teach. They didn't have to worry about the content. They spent their time thinking about how they would teach something. Right, here's some content that I need to help pupils learn. How am I going to do that? What am I going to say to the pupils to get them thinking in this particular way? What questions will I ask? How much time do I need to spend on it? They also found it made collaborative planning with colleagues in their school and across schools easier, because actually if you're a year one teacher and I'm a year one teacher, we've got the same lessons in our textbook. We might teach them in very different ways, but we can talk about, oh, how did you do that lesson? How did I do that lesson? And they found that to be quite useful in terms of enhancing collaborative work. They also found, I'd say this is a tentative finding because we're still not quite sure exactly about what's going on with this, but it seemed to be for some of them that the textbook and using the textbook did improve they felt it improved their subject knowledge for teaching. So we can't prove that, and we didn't do any tests for that, but some of the teachers did feel, they did tell us and felt that this had been an impact of what they were doing. Again, they said it influenced them and helped them with their choice of representations. Using the textbook led to fine-tuning of lessons. So actually, because if I'm a year 3 teacher 2 or 3 years in a row, I'm going to teach the same lesson 3 times year on year. So I can actually learn from when I taught that lesson last year and do it slightly differently and see if it has a different impact. They also said it did feel prescriptive at first, but then that sort of diminished as they studied it more deeply and spent more time developing their sort of professional knowledge of it. I would just say that last point is sort of real important. So going back to the beginning of when I was speaking, remember that all these teachers were involved in quite a significant curriculum development project. So they had time to meet with colleagues from other schools. They were doing classroom coaching, so getting into other people's classrooms and working alongside each other. They had a lot of time to develop their professional knowledge about how to teach maths in this way and how to use the textbook. I do wonder, and again, this is just personal opinion, actually, if they weren't doing all that, would it just continue to feel prescriptive? And I guess that's a question to open up for colleagues, is there a danger that using the textbook without the associated professional development activities doesn't have some of these positive impacts, I think. So I am going to finish in a minute, and I will just, I want to show you something which is our sort of work in development at the moment, and then I'll stop for questions. So the first thing here is that when we look at the textbook, the theory basically is that the textbook is part of the material classroom, whether they actually are using the textbook as a book in itself, or whether they're using the ideas from the textbook to help design their lessons. It is a material part of that classroom. It is a function in that maths lesson. And this is sort of based on the theory of a lady called Karen Barad, who's a quantum physicist, believe it or not. But she has a theory, and that's a quote from her. She says, matter matters. And what she means by that is physical things, materials, matter, they influence meaning, and they influence how we create meaning. So when we're doing a lesson and when we're teaching, what we're essentially doing is helping pupils to construct meaning of mathematical ideas. And actually the materials we use, the textbook being one of them, but representations being part of that as well, they are part of that meaning. So without them, it would be totally different. So therefore the textbook has a really important role. So we are using this idea of what's sometimes called material dialogic teaching. It's kind of a new idea. Dialogic teaching has been around for a long time, and it refers to teaching through dialogue. No surprise there, although it is somewhat more complex than that. Material dialogic teaching suggests that when we're thinking about teaching through dialogue, we should think about the teaching materials we're using and the voice of those materials as well. So in our study, we feel that the textbook has a voice within the dialogic teaching in a maths classroom when it's being used, and that we should sort of acknowledge that and better understand the role of that voice. So our research is kind of attempting to better understand that, I would say. So what I will do, I can also share the video of the lesson that we've been analysing. I'll share that link, so if you're interested in going to watch it, you can watch it. What we're hoping to do when we publish some of these findings from phase 2 is actually write some of our analysis of the lesson and make links to some of the points in the lesson. But I will share the link, Ruth, after this, so people can go and watch it. So I'm going to stop there. As the teacher said in the other quote, the teacher just learns to shut up. I should learn to shut up. And yeah, I wonder what questions you've got. I'd welcome any kind of questions or comments about this. Yeah, just to see what you think. So why don't I stop screen sharing?